Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 278 of Retropower Uncut. And we're going to start this week, slightly different order, just to mix things up. So we're going to start with Fiat, the Fiat Dino Coupe. And Scott has been working on two areas this week, mainly one, but two, he's just started on the second. First being the scuttle area, which had some very dubious repairs present in it. It's quite an awkward area to repair without dismantling half of the car as well. But it had some holes that had formed at the bottom of the windscreen aperture, which is very, very common, as is fairly obvious, but I'll do a brief explanation. Windscreens get fitted to cars more than once regularly in their lives. Most cars suffer a windscreen breakage at some point. The screen's removed, new one's put in, and normally somebody fitting a windscreen wouldn't attend to paintwork damage. So the paintwork was damaged in the windscreen aperture. Water gets into the bottom of these screen apertures. With the best will in the world, there's always water trapped by a seal in the bottom of a screen aperture. The water then finds the scratch in the paintwork caused by fitting the windscreen and rusts it out, and it gets through the scuttle and rots a hole in it. Really regular, pretty standard thing for most screen apertures, and this had that. So it rotted through, I think, in 3 places. I think one of those Scott might have managed to locally put a small weld into it. The others, somebody had previously put a lot of weld in. They were a right mess. Couldn't really do a localised repair. So Scott's had to put a section in from there to there, as you can see. So he's made this Z section, shaped it to the screen aperture, shaped it to the scuttle, and then welded it in. And it is quite a tricky piece to get the shape right, and he's done fairly well on that. He's got that pretty close, but it is quite a tricky piece. As you can see, there's a few little bits where we'll just have a very, very light little bit of filler in there just to tidy that up. But it is very difficult to get the levels right. It won't be immediately obvious in camera, but there's a shape like that there. There's sort of a ski jump up there, which when you weld in that, it means you need to be able to reach the underside to panel beat it, and there's a couple of areas where the access is quite tricky. Here it's very tight. In fact, you can't get it, so you have to get it from underneath inside the car, so it's quite awkward access. In fact, I think some of this was accessed from this end, using a very small sort of pin basically to get under there to push that up and then panel beat that back down. So it's quite a tricky bit of panel beating basically to get that right without going into a massive long tangent on it. But he's got it pretty close, plenty close enough that there's no more than 1 millimetre of filler needed on it, so that's absolutely fine. And then he's moved on from that onto the seat mountings. I think we mentioned this previously. I think this had a somewhat plump previous owner possibly, and the seat mountings were rather damaged and destroyed. I think it may have been jumping over bridges in Italian police chases at some point in its past, partially hence the name of the project. The seat runners had taken a bit of a beating. In fact, you can sort of see there the state of that one. It's all sort of collapsed and bent at the back, and they were all like that. They weren't the best design to start with. They weren't very strong, but these have got, you can see they're cracked as well. They're cracked in a few places, like that one is there and there. So they weren't in very good condition. So they needed replacing anyway, but also there was speculation, and it's still speculation, that the owner and us jointly might want to fit Recaro seats to this car, because I think they would be Recaro Classics would probably be in keeping with the look of the car, but would also offer a bit more support when driving, because the original seats were really not very supportive at all. So we wanted to combine the possibilities of keeping the original seats with being able to fit Recaros as well. So we're making some we had a quick measure up, and it's possible to make some slightly bigger runners when we refabricate the seat runners, to fabricate some slightly bigger ones that will allow us to fit either or of the seats. And to that end, if I just quickly run over here and grab one, Scott's drawn up and is making some slightly bigger seat runners that will have 2 options in terms of the seat mount points. He's got to shape all this to the somewhat convoluted shape of the floor, which is what he's just coming up to now, is putting the curvature on this to fit that shape of the floor. But he's folded these up. These are in 2 mil thick steel, all folded up, and then they'll have captive nuts welded into here, so that you can then fit either the Recaro runners or the Fiat runners. They'd sit just, there's a few millimetres difference in their centres, so you can fit either then, and we've got the options either way, and they're strong enough that they won't crack this time. which is the aim of the game. So that's all coming together nicely, and that's where progress is at on the Fiat. And then really the next step on this, as I've said several times, is it needs to go on the jig. But as you'll see in a bit, we are getting a little bit closer to being able to put that on the jig. And now from his lofty elevated position, I'm going to move over to the Saab, and Jamie's going to just swivel around from his position standing there on the welding bench, which is quite good. Bobby has been working on the front end, on the cooler pack. You'll recall last week he got the exhaust manifold all done, the turbo's mounted, everything's in position there. So he's continuing the plumbing with looking at the engine cooling, the AC refrigerant cooling, and the air-to-air intercooler cooling, and on the effect of all of that on the front of the car. And there's a little sequence of operations, stepping back from the details. The sequence is such that we need to make the cooler pack before he can finish the rest of the plumbing decisions, because whilst he's made this mock-up, we need to allow for the weld heights on the intercooler and the radiator. So where the end tanks weld to the core on an intercooler or a radiator, there's an unknown height of the TIG weld which attaches those end tanks. So they're going to be aluminium coolers. The intercooler is going to have an extruded aluminium core. So the tubes, if you like, that the air passes through are made of an aluminium extrusion. So there's a big long length of aluminium extrusion, basically squirted out of an extruder, sliced into rough lengths. Then those lengths are all then accurately trimmed on a nice saw. They'll be sheared off probably on an extrusion line into rough lengths with squashed ends and mauled a bit at the ends basically as they're made. Then they'll be trimmed accurately with a saw all to whatever length the core is being made to. And then they will be assembled into end plates, which are punched plates, which will be made on a CNC turret punch, punched and slightly swaged to accept the extruded tubes. Then they'll be assembled into a fixture and furnace brazed. So the end plates will then be furnace brazed to those extruded tubes, with fins assembled between the extruded tubes and also then furnace brazed between those tubes. Bit of a side a bit of a side tangent in how a core is made. But anyway, that's how the core would be made by the radiator or the intercooler manufacturer. Then the end tanks will be welded on. I'm probably teaching you all to suck eggs, and you're all very aware of how these coolers are made. But then the end tanks are welded on. So where that end plate is made, the end plate has little folded returns on it that point away from the core outwards. And then the end tank is folded like a C-section and is welded to this sort of what is then a slight C-section on the end plates. The two are then TIG welded together. So you end up with a weld line down there, and inevitably, to be reasonably strong, that weld sticks up a little bit. And whilst we can simulate the core, and we can simulate the end plates, and we can simulate the end tank, what we can't accurately simulate is the thickness of those welds sticking out. So Bobby simulated everything as best he can, but we really need the actual thing, because those welds could vary a little bit by the man who's doing them, what he had for breakfast that morning, which welder he happened to pick up, etc, etc, etc. So we can't actually simulate those, so we need to get the intercooler made and the radiator made. And to that end, Bobby is now liaising with the manufacturer in terms of how we're going to do that. We'll probably bring that into a video at some point about the detail of that process, and it would be quite nice, I'm not making any promises here, but it would be quite nice to go and do a little video at the radiator and intercooler manufacturer and show you the full process that I've just been wobbling on about how those cores are made, because a lot of people, I'm guessing, watching this probably don't know the nuances, because I don't know all of the detail. I know some of it, but I don't know all of it. I'm willing to bet that a lot of people watching this video won't know all of the detail about how those cores are made. So I think we might try and do a visit. We'll see if we can get time to try and do a visit with Jamie on the camera to go and have a look at how those cores are made, but that's a slight aside. Anyway, to that end, there's some further detail required. And I've actually been talking to Bobby this morning. The detail we were talking about this morning is how we're going to mount the air conditioning condenser matrix, which I haven't got to hand, so I can't now show you, but we're working about how to mount that. The intercooler is going to be flexibly mounted on some bushes, and in fact Jamie's got some footage of the top mounts, which are actually loosely in place at the moment. They're going to bolt through these 4 holes here. In fact, no, not those 4 holes, various holes, I lose track. They're going to be bolted through this scuttle panel anyway. It's not those holes, it's some others. They're going to be bolted through the scuttle panel, and then they have an Audi bushing, a VW Group bushing, which goes through that bracket. You'll see in Jamie's little bit of B-roll that there's Bobby has welded a doubler plate around where the bush goes, because the bush is designed to go through a deeper swaged hole, and we've actually added a doubler plate to simulate roughly the correct panel thickness for those bushes to go through, and they're on brackets that will bolt to this. We'll have pins on top of the intercooler and then go through the bushes mounted into those brackets, so we'll hold that cooler pack up and then fit this sort of upside down goalpost, if you like, that you've no doubt seen Bobby making. And this has another set of those brackets in the bottom, and there will be another set of pins on the bottom of the cooler, so the cooler will be held in place, then that goalpost will be fitted up from underneath, and then the pins on the top and bottom of the cooler pack will hold it between those bushes, so it can't escape, but it's got some flexibility to its mounting as it floats in those bushes. And the same for the radiator. There are brackets on the bottom of this goalpost. The radiator will then drop into those brackets at the bottom, and then there are some brackets at the top which will bolt on, which are welded to the intercooler, that will bolt on to, which then have a pin through into the radiator, so they then contain the radiator at the top and stop that moving, and then the fan shroud will then in turn bolt to the radiator. And that was the other thing we were discussing this morning, is exactly how we're going to fit that fan shroud, and we've now got a plan. We need to make some little machine pieces that will be welded to the outside of the radiator end tanks and top and bottom plates, that will then receive the fan shroud. The fan shroud needs to be pretty robust because these fans are quite substantial. These are some Spal brushless fans that I mentioned before, and they're pretty substantial, fairly weighty and very, very powerful. So we do need to mount these quite carefully, and we're going to neoprene gasket that to the radiator, that plate that mounts the fans, and then bolt that on with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fixings, probably 10 M6 fixings, plus a neoprene gasket will hold all that in place, stop it all moving in unwelcome directions and stop it vibrating. So there's a plan in place for all of that. Going back to the air conditioning condenser, we were looking at the fact, going back to talking about the flexible mountings, the intercooler is flexibly mounted. We can't solidly mount. It would be nice if we could just solidly mount the condenser to the intercooler. The intercooler is flexibly mounted, so it's insulated from the vibration of the car. So you'd say, that's all good. But the other thing we need to allow for is the fact that the intercooler will change shape very slightly, both due to pressure. It will grow slightly under pressure, stretch a little bit, but it will also change shape a bit with temperature, and it will see varying temperature as you drive, so it will expand and contract. And then the air conditioning condenser, even more so because it's much more slightly built, it's very small, that will stretch lengthways and contract slightly heightways, but particularly lengthways, it will stretch and shrink as it gets hot and cold, and it will get quite hot and quite, it changes temperature a lot during use, so it will actually grow and lengthways. So we can't solidly bolt the two together because they'll both be growing and contracting in comparison to each other at varying points. So what we're going to do is mount that on some small rubber bobbins to the intercooler. So there'll be 4 female threaded bosses, top hat bosses, actually welded into the end tanks of the intercooler that then accept 4 rubber bobbins, and then the AC condenser is then screwed to those rubber bobbins, and that will enable the two to shuffle slightly as they expand and contract. So there's quite a lot of thought going on there. And the other piece of thought that's gone on, where I think Jamie will be able to have some footage, and we've actually got some 3D printed props here, is we're trying to sort out a neat way, and I was discussing this yesterday with Bobby, and he's now drawn it up and 3D printed the parts, such as the skill of Bobby and the rate of throughput on our Bamboo Lab printers, is that we were trying to come up with a neat way of basically having the radiator hose exit the radiator and then transition to what's going to be quite a long top hose that runs down underneath the exhaust manifold on this side of the engine to the back, because the top hose on an 07K engine exits at the back, which is not ideal from our point of view, but we don't have a lot of choice in being able to change that, because short of reversing the cylinder head or something, we can't do a lot about that. So we're going to exit that at the back, but then bring it along under the exhaust manifold. And to make a neat transition from the radiator, we were struggling. We've not got an awful lot of space in the longitudinal axis of the car. We've not got a lot of space there. We looked at putting a bend like this directly onto the radiator, but we don't want to weld a long pipe to the radiator because it'd be very prone to cracking out of the end tank on the radiator. Likewise, it's then how one would attach a longer pipe to it. We looked at potentially using a Wiggins clamp type clamp there, but then by the time we've got that clamp in place and then added a lower mounting to restrain that tube, it all gets quite clunky, and the length of this tube means that we're still suffering the same sort of space constraints as we were doing it any other way. And the other alternative would have been to use AN fittings, but they would need to be AN 20 type fittings, you know, a JIC type aluminium fitting for the cooling water would need to be an AN 20 to maintain the 32mm inch and a quarter bore of the pipe, which is what we want to stick to. And that was a very big fitting, and I actually called a fitting supplier to get the dimensions of an AN 20 swivel elbow, and it's so long that it again gives us a problem with the space against the turbo. And actually the conclusion was, between Bobby and I, that it would be neatest to just machine our own fitting. So the plan is to use an O-ring fitting, flange type fitting, so an O-ring sleeved in. We'll get this piece machined, which will then weld to the radiator. That will be sent to the radiator manufacturer, and that will be welded into the top of the radiator. This will be made slightly undersized and then reamed to size after welding, because the welding will change the shape of this hole. So that will be made undersized and then reamed to size afterwards. Then this piece will be machined from aluminium, fairly simple to machine that, with an O-ring groove on the outside. That then slides into that on the radiator and is retained by a bolt, and then the pipe will then be welded into the bottom of that, and then that will give us the transition down, and then there'll be a silicon joiner which joins, this will carry on a little bit further, then there'll be a silicon joiner which will allow for the engine movement, well, the engine movement here, this will be fixed, engine movement there, there'll be a short section of silicon, which will actually be a 45-degree bend, I think, or a 90-degree bend there, and then that will transition to the aluminium water rail that runs round to the back of the engine, that's all solidly mounted to the engine. So, very neat solution. As usual, quite work heavy, not the cheapest solution, but actually any other way of doing it is either going to look rubbish or be rubbish or both. So we've concluded the nicest way is just, as is quite often the case, make a part that's exactly designed to do the job within the constraints that you find yourself within. So that's what's happening there. Good progress. Things are all coming together. I think that's enough talking about that, because that's quite a long talk about that. We'll move on from that on to Project Munich. So I'm going to swing around here, Jamie's going to swing around there. There's a bit of a weld extractor boom in the way, so I'll go here, I think. I think Jamie can manage that one. I'm going to lean on the car. I'm not actually going to look at it. Jamie's got B-roll, so we're not going to go into all the detail on that. Needless to say, Stu now has the offside quarter panel fitted, which is quite a nice step forward. And I'd actually not noticed that happening because I've been so busy doing other things, I hadn't actually noticed that he'd got the quarter panel fitted, but he has, and that's looking really, really nice. And so the next step really is going to be getting the other quarter panel fitted, which he's getting towards, but he's carrying out a couple of repairs on the inner quarter panel and the inner quarter panel, because there's two sections there, prior to fitting that now. And interestingly, one of those leads me on to another little tangent, so you'll have to bear with me. But basically, can I see the piece he's making? Yes, I can. Bear with me. I'm going to be back in camera shot in a moment. Let me just pick this up, because it's a very good exercise in making a repair section. So Jamie's got some B-roll of this, but Stu's made this piece, which is outwardly a pretty straightforward piece. And there's his template for it. However, as you'll know from Jamie's B-roll, the piece he started making was a lot bigger than that. And it's an interesting exercise in how to make a very small, detailed piece that's got quite a lot of shape to it. Because a lot of people make a mistake of trying to make a piece like that from a piece that's almost that size. And that's the mistake, is you need to start by making a much bigger piece. And this is a very, very good example of that, where the shape that's involved on these two edges is quite substantial. So there's quite a lot of stretching of the metal involved in making that. And if you set out to make a piece that's about the size of the piece you want to end up with, when you stretch those edges, that piece is going to change shape dramatically, and you will end up with something that won't work, basically. You end up with a piece of scrap and you'll throw it in the bin. What you need to do is start by making a piece that's much bigger. So you make a template of the area you need to make the repair for. The other thing, to pick up on something I mentioned last week, is you also don't cut out the bit you're trying to repair until after you've made the repair section. Again, kind of stating the obvious, but I've seen it time and time again in years gone by, where people go to make a repair, see some rust on their car, cut the rust out, and then go, right, I'm going to make a repair for that hole. Ah, but what shape was it? Oh, I don't know now because I've cut it out. Don't touch the rusty bit until you've made the repair bit. Basically, leave it alone. Don't even, if it looks really fragile, literally don't touch it. Use your eyes and make the repair section by eye to the rusty remains that you can see. But do not cut them out and do not touch them until you've made the repair piece, then cut them out. So Stu's looked at the rusty piece, which in this case was smaller rust holes on the inner C pillar, you'd call it, if it had a B pillar. And he's then made this larger section, which he's then stretched all the detail into, hammered all that detail in just the old-fashioned way, flat piece, made to a template, and then hammered it all in on the anvil, on the stake anvil, stretched all that shape into it, but he's made it much bigger. And then he's trimmed it back progressively to the size of the actual piece he needs to fill the gap. But the benefit of starting big is, A, you know it's big enough. You don't end up accidentally making the bit a bit too small. And again, people watching this will have probably done this at some point, because I certainly have, made the piece and then found that it didn't quite cover one of the rust holes and you've got a bit to fill with weld. You don't want to end up with that. You want to end up with a piece big enough that it covers all the rusty bits and removes all the bits you wanted to remove. So starting too big means you can trim it back and you never end up with it too small at the end. But the other thing is that extra material around, when you're trying to stretch these holes, although it makes the job of stretching it harder, there's more to stretch. There's also much more material to restrain the bit that you're stretching. So if you start with a much bigger piece, it's very hard for that piece to all pull in as you stretch those areas. So it means that the material does stretch and doesn't just pull the whole piece to it. Which if you've tried doing this sort of thing, you'll have found this problem. You need enough restraining material around the edge to restrain the area that you're trying to stretch from just pulling the surrounding material to it. So that's what Stu's done there. There's a lot of waffle again, I know, but all of these things are the key skills to doing this sort of job, which are not necessarily evident until you've made the mistake of doing it the wrong way. So whenever you're trying to make a piece where you've got to hammer quite a lot of shape into it, start with a much bigger piece. The surrounding material will restrain the piece you're trying to shape from just changing shape in the wrong direction. Useful tip. So yeah, Stu's made that bit. He'll be welding that bit in shortly. And then I think that's pretty much the pillars all good. I can hear the welders running now because I can hear the fan on it, so I don't think he's a million miles away from repairing that bit. And then I think he'll be on fairly short countdown to getting this quarter panel on. And that's really quite an exciting point, because all of the outer bodywork is in place at the back. And to be honest, most of the inner, because the boot floor's now in, most of the inner is also in place. At that point, things are really moving forward, because most of the final fabrication on the front relies on us taking the engine out now. So yeah, watch this space. I need to probably have a sit down with Stu and we'll go through a bit of a plan, because we need to work out, try not to do things twice. So we probably need a bit of a plan, but still have most of that in his head, because he invariably does. He doesn't let on these things, but he'll invariably have most of a plan in his head to start with anyway. So we'll have a little chat through that beginning of next week, I think, and work out the way forward. But certainly the fabrication stage of this is really progressing well. So I think at that point, it's probably time to go and have a little look at the Aston Martin. So, on to Aston Martin. And oh, there's somebody coming through a door. Here's Joe, look. Joe's walking through. What's Joe been up to? Right, he's come wandering back from the machine shop. So anyway, on to Aston DBS. And as you can see, all sorts of things going on this. There's not one piece of progress, there's multiple. Matt has got the front end bodywork refitted. He's got the back bodywork refitted. His main drive of the week has been completing the rear arch inner tubs. So that's not the inner tub, it's the outer part of the inner tub. Basically extending the wheel tubs out to meet with the inner face of the outer quarter panel. And the panel that does that is an aluminium section with a profile on the outer edge of it to follow the profile around the wheel arch. And that profile has a 90-degree return on it, so that we've got a layer that we can bond with a polyurethane adhesive to the inner face of the outer quarter panel. Hard to explain all that. Matt has made a cardboard pattern. I think we touched on this last week, but Matt's made a cardboard pattern, extended it out to the quarter. As expected, he had to redo the cardboard pattern for this side of the car because the two sides of the car are never going to be equal. It's a hand-built car, and we've reused the Aston quarter panels, and I'm not even going to try and claim that if we'd made the quarter panels they would be perfectly symmetrical, because they wouldn't. And that panel is quite a good, well, it's actually a very good fit. Matt's made a beautiful job of it. Hopefully that comes over on camera, but Matt's made a beautiful job of it. I would say he's within 1 millimetre all the way around that panel to the inner quarter. So the glue line will be really neat around there. We're really happy. I've done really happy with that. He's done a beautiful job of it. So he's made a cardboard template, rolled the cardboard in, transferred that line from the quarter to the cardboard. He's then used the cardboard, unrolled on the bench to transfer that pattern onto a piece of aluminium, added the distance for the return onto the edge of that. He's used the bead roller, or Jenny, the tipping rolls in that, to put to start that return fold on the edge. He's then tipped that up by hand, and then stretched and shrunk that return to get the wheel arch tub accurate, and then he's got that in place and fitted that, screwed that in place onto the inner arch tub, and it's actually looking beautiful. So he's got both sides of that done now. That's literally ready to just screw in place and bond when the car actually goes together for the final time, when the bodywork goes on for the final time. So he's got that in place. As I say, he's refitted the front body, and then he has fitted the tie bars. Now, I think we mentioned this before. We had a bit of calamity with these. I'll elaborate slightly on this. George Sinclair has machined the rear tie bars for this. We did have to have a couple of goes at them. We initially decided that the safer option for doing the left-hand thread was to use a die to cut it, and that was a bit of a mistake. I may have bought a slightly cheap die, and basically, to be honest, it was a load of old rubbish, and I think the die is probably now in the bin, and the swear box got filled quite a lot, because it managed to cut a variable pitch thread, which is a new one on me. I don't know quite how that can occur, but the die cut a variable pitch thread. It was a cyclically variable, but unfortunately variable to the point where it was useless. So we scrapped the first set of those, and George has now made a new set. We bought I bought a couple more threading inserts, and he's cut those in the lathe now and done a beautiful job of them in the lathe and made a really nice job. And we should have just done that to start with. So hey ho, lesson learned. Here we are, but he's made the tie bars, so that they're a pair of EN16 bars. They started with 16mm EN16T round bright bar, and then thread cut one end of that with a M16 by 1.5 thread, and then on the other end turn that down to 14mm and cut an M14 by 1.5mm thread on the other end. The M16 thread is a left-hand thread, the M14 is a right-hand thread. We're going to mill two little flats on the middle of that bar as well. On the inside end is a female M16 by 1.5 reverse threaded rod end, rose joint as you might want to call it, with some side spaces, some angulation side spaces fitted to it, and then that bolts in, and they also reduce the board down, the bolt bore down to M12, and that's then retained in the rear subframe, which is actually part of the chassis, by an M12 bolt and those side spaces. And at the outer end we're using a Corvette C6 track rod end, which is the same as a front one. It basically it fits the rear upright the same as a front one. And then that acts as the rear tie bar and toe adjuster. So that's now an in situ adjuster on that link, because the threads are reversed one side and right hand thread the other, means that it's an in situ adjuster. So we've got those in place on the back now, and we can put the back suspension through its travel. and we now have the wheel centres you've seen on a previous week where Matt cut the original centres out of these cheap steel wheels, cut the centres out, so we now have a plain bore on these steel wheels. We cut these centres on the CNC plasma cutter to match our PCD and bore on the wheels, and then they're a nice sliding fit in these wheels, so we can put them in, tack them in place, have a play with offsets, see where we're at. Obviously the rear isn't set at the moment, they're just sort of slid on, but we're playing with offsets and checking clearances, and then that has now, we've done the same on the front. Matt has done some mock-up tie bars. I've got the parts to make up the front track rods, inner track rods now. I think I may have mentioned this in a previous week, not sure. We're using a Subaru GC8, I think it is. No, it's a slightly later Subaru power steering rack on this. And the Subaru track rods are actually too long to use on this. The threads are too far outboard, so that we can't use, if we use a Corvette C7 track rod end, which is what we need to use for the Corvette C7 front uprights on this, the track rod end is so long that it goes past where all the thread would be on the Subaru track rod. Although it's the correct thread, it sits too far inboard, so no good. So I had a bit of a head scratch and search around and came up with I thought, well, what I need is a really short inner track rod, and then I can make my own extension for that to join the two together. And what I've actually come up with is found a Citroen C6 of all things inner track rod. Has the correct thread for the Subaru rack. It's M14 by 1.5 right-hand thread on the inner end of the inner ball joint, and then it has a really short outer section with a female I believe M14 by 1.5 thread in there. Sorry, no, M14 by 1.5 thread in there as well, right-hand thread. And then the Corvette track rod ends are also M14 by 1.5. So what we're going to do is make an M14 by 1.5 piece of threaded bar in EN16T, and then we're going to screw that in. It won't be threaded all the way along, it'll have a plain section in the middle. That'll be threaded at the inner end into the Citroen C6 inner tie bar end, and then that'll be Loctited. It'll be lock nutted and Loctited with a fairly high strength Loctite into that, so that doesn't try and move normally. And then the Corvette track rod end will screw onto the outside, have a normal lock nut on there, and then when you try and turn that to set the tracking, it should just spin the inner ball joint and not loosen the thread, because that'll be Loctited in with heavy duty Loctite into the inner, and that will all work. I'm sure I could have explained that in a simpler way, but I can't think of one. So anyway, yes, we've got a Subaru rack, Subaru Impreza rack, Citroen C6 inner track rod end, custom made centre section that would be removable and reusable, and then Corvette C7 outer. So that means all of the pivot points, the C7 outer ball joint, the Citroen C6 inner ball joint, are both replaceable with off-the-shelf parts, and the bit that connects them together is a unique part, but it is just a straight bar with M12 by 1.5 threads on each end. So it's all very replaceable, very serviceable, no custom made awkward bits in there. It's all serviceable going forward. That was the plan. Phew! Right, on from that, Matt is now going to be starting to make the inner wing, the muck shields, if you like. I was going to use a different word there, but basically the inner wings, which just prevent the dirt spraying into the engine bay. That's all they have to do now. But we do need them to look reasonable, and they do need to avoid quite a lot of other parts. So I'm not going to go into all the detail on that now. That'll be for another week when you can actually seal those parts. But that's the next move, is to get onto those, and I think Matt and Cal and Luke are probably upstairs having a discussion on all that area at the moment, because Cal and I started having a discussion, and it's not quite, as is usually the way with building cars, it's not quite as simple as you might think. But we'll go into that another time. The other little mention I'm going to do while we're around here is a quick shout out to Matt at Stakesies. I haven't mentioned him for a while, I will this time. He sent us out at extremely in an extremely speedy fashion this set of tank rolls. I've got various radii of tank roll, but I didn't have any 1.5 ones, and he's just sent me with a very speedy service a set of 1.5 radius tank rolls. So much appreciated, Matt. Thank you very much. I hope you're doing well. Probably won't see this because I don't think he watches a lot of car-related stuff online, to be honest. But I do need to catch up with Matt at some point. We've been talking about this for a while and we still haven't. We're going to go and have a fat old man mountain bike ride somewhere. So and I've been promising this for about 6 months, but then I've been doing up my house. So that's absorbed all my time. So anyway, shout out to Matt at Stacey's. You can see the posters around, oh, not up there, but the poster up there. Shout out to Matt at Stacey's Metalwork Machinery. Top man. If you need anything for working with sheet metal, Matt's your man. And on that note, I think I'm going to hand over to Mark and let him show you where we're at on bodywork stuff, because it's all coming together in there as well.
Right. See Gaz in the wild lot over there, buffing away. Probably listening to some rubbish podcast about hunting or something.
Someone's going to do it.
Eh?
Someone's going to do it.
All right, cut the sound a minute, guys. You have yourself a rest. Go on. Right. Very good. You just stand down for a minute, soldier. All right. Welcome back. Get all the silly nonsense out of the way then. So, as you've seen in the last episode, the car was painted. Now Gaz has ruined it. As you can see, look.
I have
No. What we've done, well, what Gaz has done, I've helped a little bit. I think I just wet flatted a rear quarter. So what he's done, he started with 1500 discs here, 3M. Well, they're 2000s, but he did do 1500 ones of these with a DA over. And what do you do then, Gaz? Do you wet flat it with the 15s or just go? Then he does a wet flat with a little black pad here, another 3M. 3M, if you're watching, sort us out, sort Gaz out. So yeah, we like this little rubber pad, 3M. We have like the 1500 paper. We have a spray bottle, like a pump one, and like a weed killer bottle kind of. Oh heck, here it is, with some Jensen parts on it, because it must. Oh yeah, it splurts out. So yeah, you just like keep it wet, constant. Make sure there's no dirt on it, because you get a bit of dirt on it, you hear a nasty little like you run your fingers down a blackboard, that horrible noise. Jamie puts that in over this, everyone, I love that. So yeah, so we do that all over the panel with this. Then you crack the 2000 discs out. Then after that, crack the 2000 paper out. Just make sure it's like gets rid of all the peel, makes it like glass basically. And then buzzed it with 3000 discs. That starts theoretically polishing it. The 3000 does exactly. I think you could go to 8000, but be a bit overkill for this. And then, like, as you say, you start now polishing with a mop, as we call it, with the with Freckler 360. Start buffing that up. Sometimes we like to then use a bit of the 3M stuff, the extra compound, this one. Yeah, so just keep polishing it. As you see, I mean, it's polished the bonnet now, look. Looking nice. Yeah, probably then just go over, check out some bits just on the edges and stuff, or if there's just a little bit of dirt still showing. And that's it. So we'll probably be doing this for about, I reckon, 3 more days? 2 more days?
Oh,
yeah, what? 2 or 3 more days. This would be all bolted back together. Oh, also, he's painted the side skirts. What else was it, Gaz? All the handles and stuff, weren't there? Handles and little bits of trims what go around the rear lights. Handles, like I just said, and some little other bits. And basically that's it. So probably the next video, you'll see this either still in here, probably back in the paint booth, will probably burn through. Nah, you ain't gonna do that. Now I've said that, it's probably gonna happen. Or it'll be going onto the trailer, or you'll probably see it back at the den, having the interior and all the parts put back on. So thank you for watching my part, and I'll see you next week.
Right, well, thank you very much for that, Mark. And straight handing over to Cal, let him take you through what's going on in the assembly shop. I think he's probably going to cover a bit of what I was working on. I'm going to let Cal talk about it, in that there's a bit of progress on the front of the E-Type, the bonnet on the E-Type. I think I mentioned this last week and I think it didn't get picked up, but I'll mention to Cal to pull it into this week's video, because mine's already overflowing, so he can pick that bit up on what I was doing on the front of the E-Type, because we now have some progress. After quite a lengthy battle, we have some progress.
Thank you very much, Nat. Right, I'm starting with the usual Roundstone coffee and admiring the absolute bomb site of the kitchen, because one of our customers has just brought us copious amounts of sweet treat. and consequently the kitchen for a short while was crammed with all of the Retropower staff frantically trying to get their hands on sweet treats. What I will mention is the keyring, the new keyring design we've done. I think I mentioned this last week. We're making these in-house, which means we can do custom colour combinations. So there's something like 40 leather colours to choose from and a load of different hardware finishes, which I think gives something like 115 different permutations. So far there has not been one made the same, which is really cool to see. So if you want to get over onto the website and order those, that would be very much appreciated. And they come in a very, very cool little tin, which is kind of a replica or nod to a classic tobacco tin. And we all know you're going to use it to store random trinkets and bits of old car that never, that screw that was left over after putting together the interior that you don't know where it came from. Right, moving on into the workshop and starting with Project Churchill wood, which from this side at least is looking absolutely stunning because we've got loads of the copper trim on now. Got the door frame in, got the gutter mouldings temporarily in place, the door handles temporarily in place. And we're starting to see that culmination of all the effort with the copper plating looking absolutely stunning. One of the reasons this door frame's in at the moment is because Luke needed to rescan that to finish his door card work, which he'll probably mention shortly. And then another Luke related step forward on this is he's finished printing all of the centre console surround panels now. Got those all mounted in place, that's all looking great. I just want to do a mock-up now of the fascia panel, so we'll do a mild steel plasma cut section to just trial fit that and make sure we're happy with the CAD for the fascia panel itself. And then we can move forward to starting to upholster some of this. So I've already done the rear seats, already done the parcel shelf, the rear quarter panels. It's just this door card which needs finishing, and then the sides of the centre console, and then we can start piecing that console together. So yeah, very, very exciting to get to that stage. Also, Gibbo's been high jeopardy doing the fillet insertion on this windscreen seal, which is always an awkward job because you have to use the tool right next to really shiny paint, but that's gone okay. Next step will be fitting the copper trims around this. And then there's a copper trim that goes on the rear window as well. In a fashion that always baffles me. Like on the front, there's a lip that goes each side of the trim, which is fairly normal. That's how you'd expect a moulding to go around a window seal. On the back, really strangely, there's only a lip on the inside. And I remember when we did Project Utah, this really confused me, that the trim just kind of sits in, and the only thing that stops it popping out this way is just it's holding its own natural shape. Very, very strange design. But anyway, next rear trim going on the back of this will be one of the next things, and then we'll really start to see the copper coming together. And then we're also doing a custom number plate, which I think Luke will mention shortly. But essentially we wanted to do a self-illuminating number plate. It was a request from the customer for this car. And I love the idea of it because it means we haven't got to clutter up the rear end with a number plate light, because basically the numbers will illuminate themselves, but Luke will show you that shortly. Staying with the Jaguar theme, Project Geneva E-Type, a few different avenues of progress on this at the minute. Nat has been bathing in a mass of carbon fibre dust carrying on with the bonnet. So he kind of crossed the final hurdle to getting the fit really nice on this week, which was actually very small variations in the thickness of the layup, which were causing a surprisingly big issue elsewhere. So we were finding that these side sections right down near the sill were just bowing out more than we'd expect and not sitting in aligned with the sill. And we'd been making all sorts of small changes to it, but actually one of the biggest differences was when we went onto the B surface of both the inner and the outer layers and sanded them down, particularly where there were thicker sections where the layup had been kind of overlapped. We probably haven't made more than 1 millimetre or so of difference to the thickness, but that made a huge difference to the overall. It basically allowed the two to sit nicer together, and that sort of almost, it took some of the stress out of this area here, and that's sitting so much nicer now. So what we're going to do is do a final kind of clamp up of this all in place, make sure we're happy with the shape of everything. This is looking good here. When we do the final bond, we're going to space it with these blue spacers like we've got in now to actually hold it in further inboard than where it wants to be, on the basis that we're expecting a little degree of spring out after we've released all the clamps. So we're kind of pre-loading it slightly during bonding to allow for that. And then what George is on with at this exact moment actually is to do with the bonnet latches. So we're doing custom latches on this. They're going to actuate using the original sort of chrome lever in the cockpit, but a custom latch design. And what we've decided to do is basically do a 3D print which combines the striker and latch assembly into one unit, so that we can then bolt that up to the mounting points on the bulkhead, mark through to the mounting points on the bonnet with that assembly basically in the middle of its adjustment. So we can then drill and tap where it attaches to the bonnet, because what we've done is incorporate solid carbon fibre mounting pads, here's the very thing, on the bonnet, and they'll be drilled and tapped directly. And we thought probably a good idea to drill and tap those whilst the inner and outer are separate, because it takes out of the equation the possibility of accidentally drilling all the way through the bonnet outer whilst doing that. But this is the representation of both the latch and striker, this part here being the striker, this part here being the latch. This kind of V shape here will be where the striker comes down into, but we've printed it essentially as one complete unit, so we can bolt that to the bulkhead and then mark through the holes onto the bonnet and drill and tap that, and then this will actually be used to bolt the whole assembly together to simulate it having the bonnet latched, but without having to risk damaging final machined parts. And this will be more relevant actually when it's through in the body shop, because during bonding we're going to clamp it all the way around there, but once it's in the body shop it won't have all those clamps on. It'll be relying on the rubber seal that sits along the back there and the bonnet being bolted shut by virtue of those latches. So that's kind of the next step on that. And then the engine is also in progress, so this is about to go over to be machined now. We've got the liners and pistons from Rob Beer now, so this is one of the liners. Nice little demo of how these engines look. So it's a wet liner design. These liners are basically pressed in, and this shoulder here sits up against the top of this part of the block, and then the bottom sits up against a register further down there. And then there's nothing that link these. At this top section here, these just sit as individual circles essentially across here. There's nothing interlinking to this top face of the block like you might associate with a lot of other engine designs, where the block is basically a solid piece with waterways kind of cast into it, and the liners are kind of part of that overall mass. These are separate, and then the head obviously mates down onto these with the head gasket between, but there's nothing kind of linking between the two here. Once these have been machined, or that's been machined to fit these, and the whole lot had the liners pressed in, it may then need the deck face here machining. It might not. It comes down to whether these sit exactly flush with this, and whether the front cover also sits exactly flush, and if they don't, it'll just have a skim once all the liners are in to bring everything absolutely perfectly into true. So progress on the engine, and then the rear axle. So brake wise, we are using XK8 / Aston Martin DB7 rear brakes on this. So the whole rear axle is kind of a hybrid of various pre-existing components. So we're using the outboard disc hub carriers you might expect to find on an XJS. And then we're using the biggest brake package you could get with that setup, which is what was used on the DB7 and on the XK8, which is big vented discs and Brembo 4-pot calipers. And then we're using our custom hubs, which we've made, because that outboard disc setup never had a centerlock spline type hub. You can buy a bolt-on adapter, but we had custom hubs machined because we didn't really like the idea of having a bolt-on adapter. So a custom hub that allows the wire wheel design to fit to the outboard disc setup. And as part of that overall plan, we have just mocked up the back plate on a used hub carrier, done a full kind of build of the hub, disc, caliper, back plate, and then Luke's had that to scan and then do a basic 3D model of that, so we can then generate some engineering drawings to give to the wheel manufacturer, so they can be 100% sure that the wheel will not clash any part of that assembly, whether it be the lower pivot part of the hub carrier, the back plate, or the caliper. It just means there's no risk of wheel clearance issues. Touch wood. So that's where we're at with that. And then for Jarko, you might need to do a reverse, I think. So Jensen, quite a bit going on with this at the minute. So we've just got the exhaust manifolds on for the final time. Got the lambda bosses in those, so the lambda sensors have been connected up. Got the exhaust system on back to about where the axle is, and that's as far as we can go with it really until we get the fuel tank, which I believe is going to be in the next week and a half. As soon as that's in, we can fit the back half of the exhaust system, which is all ready to go. Steve's been busy wiring wise, so we obviously received the wiring harness back a week and a half ago, I think it was now. So he's just going through everything on that. So for instance, he's fed the wires through to the number plate lights now, assembled all the number plate light unit, got the new LED bulbs in that, got that all into place. He's done the sublooms for the rear lamp units, because what we've done is take it to a Deutsch DTM connector, which is for the rear light, and then we've made a little subloom which just branches, because it's just spades onto the bulb holders themselves. So rather than having the loom terminated with spades, which I think looks a little bit untidy, we've kind of got a little subloom in there, so it's a DTM connector, and then if anything ever happens to those spades, we can just basically unplug and replace that whole back section. Front end as well, lights is on with that, so we've got LED bulbs going into this, and he's just running the wiring through, terminating those with the H4 connectors, getting those connected up at the front. Gibbo's also done the last bit of the AC plumbing. There was a pipe just running down from the, I think it's from the condenser to a bulkhead fitting where we're passing it through the inner wing there. And that is the pipe that has the trinary switch in, which is the pressure switch, which basically tells the compressor to kick in if there's enough pressure in the system, and kick out again if the pressure gets too high, and it also controls the fan switching. So he's crimped up the pipes with that connector in there, that switch in there, and got that pipe installed. I think we are still waiting on the remaining clip to come back from plating to finish this chrome strip at the back here. So in other news, it's basically carrying on with the printing of the 3D printed centre console to get it to the same point as Churchill, and then we'll be able to take that back out and get that ready for upholstery. I feel like I'm sort of slowing down in my conversation there, because I feel like there's something else on this that I was going to talk about, and I can't remember, but this video is already quite long, so I'll perhaps move on to the next thing. So Portofino, largely exhaust on this. So last week we saw Joe starting to do the rear fabrication part of the exhaust. That's all now done. Everything's in for the final time. George Sinclair's working on the fan arrangement at the front, so we're just trying to work out the biggest, highest capacity cooling fans we can get in there. And then he's going to be fabricating a shroud which covers the whole of the radiator and mounts those fans in, which I think he's literally just drawing up on CAD at the minute. So not massive sort of strides forward on this one at the minute, just little details. But I think on that note, I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Luke to talk about what he's up to in the CAD den. So here's Luke.
We're not doing the whole naming it, are we? The life's become a bleak place since we stopped naming the CAD cave. It's become bleak.
Respect it.
Yeah. Anyway, hello, welcome to the CAD cave, or as Luke would do it, hello and welcome to the CAD cave. I'm going to jump straight in, as usual, with what I've been up to this week. So, primarily scimitar, unsurprisingly. I've been on with the apertures. So I mentioned it last week. I think, I don't know if I'd started last week or not. But yeah, either way, this week I'm on apertures. So it's been the general door area of the scimitar, and also the rear window, which is where I've been on the last day or so. Long story short, we had a plan when it comes to all the seals we were going to use and different things. And then we've kind of had a bit of a brainstorm, me, Cal and Nat, and kind of had a bit of a revision of that. And we're actually going to go to more of a standard style in terms of, as in like what the scimitar was in terms of the seals, just to try and keep things a bit simpler. So that's resulted in us ordering a load of new seals and them being predictably different to the originals, and then me having to change the apertures to then actually mean that they actually seal. So Jamie, I think you caught me scanning yesterday? Yeah, so I scanned the rear window aperture and the rear window. I then got that into Fusion and modelled it, which is what is on my screen currently. And then what I've done is, if you look at the red part on this, which Jamie, I will give some footage for Jamie to kind of overlay. The red part is what I need the aperture to be, roughly. And the grey bit / the pink bit is what the seal looks like and what the frame currently looks like. Then if I jump across, I've then brought that into our model of what the body looks like currently. And then this red bit is where, like I said, what I need to get the aperture to fit to. So I've currently got the inside edge working with that. I just need to kind of figure out how we're going to do that transition for this angled part, because how the scimitar screen works is, if I go back to this file, I'm going to do some pointing now. You've got, this is the metal part, and then you've got a clamp seal like this, which sits onto this lip here. Obviously not to scale. Well, I'm not going to do that, but yeah, it kind of sits on that seal like that, which then this part of the seal then clamps on this surface. But it's also got this like wind edge seal, which is like a little fin which pokes out, and that's designed to sit on an angled face like I've got here, which is the key design change difference to how it was before we went back to this style. The problem is the length of this seal, the new replacement one, is actually shorter than the original, which means if we just copied the original design and then used the new seal, it wouldn't actually touch, which isn't ideal. So I've had to change this around a little bit and kind of bring this all in and change the angles to mean that this seal should hopefully touch the body and then stop water and other bits and bobs going in there and just general wind noise, which is what we believe that seal's for. And breathe. So that's what I've been doing on the rear. Also, I've got the surfacing back from Alistair Pugh, A2P2, for the sides, so the side window apertures and the door frames, and I've started bringing that in as well. I haven't got as far with that yet because I've kind of been doing the rear window, which is a lot easier because it's just flat. Do the rear window first, figure out all the gaps and everything, and then go from there. And then also figuring out how we're going to kind of make everything talk to each other, because like I said, the actual seals you can get now aren't quite the same as what the original ones were, so we're kind of making the car suit the new seals rather than just directly copying the original car and the seals not really working very well. So I've just been adjusting kind of tolerances and gaps everywhere, so in theory it should all fit like absolutely perfectly. So yeah, that's what I've been doing with scimitar, and then I've actually briefly been getting back on with some E-type stuff, which is, I'm sure Nat's going to talk about his progress with the bonnet and bonnet inner and outer skins. He's primarily been working on that and kind of getting them all so they can fit together. We're now at a point where we think we're effectively ready for glue, but it's a nice point to actually check our bonnet latch and everything, which we designed a couple of months ago, which I couldn't obviously test because I can't test it until we've got the bonnet in the car like it is now. So now I'm doing a quick 3D print of like effectively the entire mechanism, which is, is this going to work? It is going to work. So for context, because it's been quite a long time since I've actually talked about this, redesigned this whole latch mechanism for a couple of reasons. The original ones are just a bit janky and not very refined. Also, you have to open the bonnet with two people on a standard E-type because the bonnet twists and then the bottoms catch the original latches. We didn't want that, so hopefully this latch system kind of fixes that. And what it means is you get this blue part and this grey part which bolts to the bonnet, and then that will then come down. That's got two pins in it. This pin locates it side to side, and then it's got this kind of funnel mechanism which then allows, which in theory takes up the twist of the bonnet, so when it comes down and you're lifting it from one side, it should align the bonnet how you want it to in terms of the left and right. And then we've got this secondary pin here, which then as the bonnet comes down, it's then caught by this crank, and then same as an original E-type works, you pull a lever inside the cabin and that then rotates this crank and actually pulls the bonnet down into the seals, and that holds it in the forward and aft position. So obviously how this mounts is relevant to our carbon bonnet, which has got different mounting points to the standard style. We've gone, well, we've got a new inner skin, we've got a new outer skin, we might as well actually make the mounts exactly what we want them to be, so they're a bit beefier than the original, and it also gives us a bit more scope for kind of adjustability, which is where these cars are a bit not amazing, should we say. They use a lot of shims normally to kind of get everything adjusted, which shims work, but they're a bit of an untidy way, so we're trying to get around that. And this new way of doing this whole system should mean it's a lot tidier and neater, and the key thing being you don't need two people to open the bloody bonnet. So yeah, all of that rambling has culminated in the fact that I couldn't test it until we got to the point where we are at now with the bonnet, which now that's all on. It's not glued yet, but it's on. So I've got this whole arrangement printing so we can try it on the car and see how it's all looking, and hopefully it will kind of just all match up. But at the moment it's a lot of theories, because obviously it was assumed that the bonnet's inner and outer are going to end up a certain way and the car's going to end up a certain way, and ultimately anyone who's worked on cars knows it doesn't actually work like that. So hopefully this will all kind of line up, and if it doesn't line up, then the prototypes will be able to tell what we need to adjust, so then we can make it all work. And yeah, there'll be more on this to come. Hopefully we'll be bonding it first part of next week. We'll see how we get on with all that. But these prints should be done by the end of today, so hopefully I'll be able to test them by the end of today, or if not tomorrow at some point. Which, if I do and they work, well, even if they don't work, I'm sure Jamie will get a bit of footage of that. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to pass out because I'm talking so quick and rambling like a madman. So I'm going to now pass over to Luke, and so you can see what he's been up to. Thank you.
Hello viewers, my first video as an engaged man. I want to give first of all a shout out to my wonderful fiancée Lucy, because we got engaged this weekend and it went fantastically. Also big shout out to George who took the photos, because they're bloody amazing. And yeah, so she watches every single video, so I just wanted to give her a quick shout out. Now back to work. So this has actually been an incredibly busy week. And I'm feeling it. I'm incredibly tired, so I'm sorry if that's showing on camera. Red Bull, if you want to sponsor me, if anyone watching this works at Red Bull and you want to sponsor me, I will jump my car off a cliff, because I know that's what you guys like to see. But no, so we've been on with, or I've been on with, kicking it off with what I left off with last week, which was the E-Type interior, and kind of like the finalisation of the design of that. Ages ago we got the design of the dash leading into the center console. You know, you've seen it, there's the dash, it swoops down next to you, looks really cool, made out of carbon fibre, just an incredibly cool piece. We also had the concept down for the front door card. So last week I mentioned how I was kind of continuing on that design process into the rear cabin, the rear door cards, kind of making the front door cards as manufacturable pieces and all of that good stuff. Well, I don't think we actually showed you anything last week, because there were some last minute design changes which I did, which kind of just improved it massively. So we're like, we'll just hold off for now, and then I can do a big reveal this week. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but what I'm going to do is show you these lovely renders. I'm really happy with them. The client seems to be really happy with them, despite being stuck in Dubai currently. It kind of picked up his mood a little bit, which is really nice. And yeah, no, that whole process was just a big challenge of just making it look both right for the car and also right for the design that we had already done for the front of the cabin, and kind of making sure that was all continuous throughout the entire interior. So as I said, I'm really happy with them. And now there's going to be a process of when I can get in the car, once the bonnet's all bonded together and all that sort of stuff, just making all of these as manufacturable parts and kind of producing them so they can go get trimmed. Also, on the E-Type, as you can see on my desk, there is a incorrectly named Aston Martin, well, it's not incorrectly named, it is an Aston Martin caliper, but it is for the E-Type, and these are some custom hub adapters for the wire wheels which we're putting onto them. And I also, basically this week, just modelled this entire thing in CAD, so we can send off the CAD along with some drawings of the CAD to the wheel manufacturer to make sure that the wheels are going to clear everything that they need to clear, and we're not going to have any issues there. So that's all being done and dusted. and I just went to town making sure that was as accurate as possible, both so the wheel isn't going to have any issues whatsoever, and also possibly so we can do some really cool renders right at the end of the process of the build for the client. So I think that's pretty much it for the E-Type. And then the other really exciting thing that I've been on with this week is on the Churchill in general. First of all, with the center console. So maybe 2 weeks ago now, I finished printing all the pieces for the center console, got them all bonded together, and I was kind of waiting for all the copper trim to be put onto the door card so I could do one big scan to finish off the remaining brackets I had to do for the center console, and also to finish off the offside door card, because the design for this was done, but what I had to do for the front one was trim around some of like the copper trim pieces at the top. And anyone who's ever worked with classic cars will know one side is never the same to the other side. So I never wanted to pull the trigger on the, say, like a mirror of the near side door card without being able to scan where all that trim is in place and trimming around it. And thank God I did wait, because it is different. But this here is a prototype of the top of the upper door card. So I can now put the door card on, get the lads downstairs to install the upper dash. I've got a prototype of the dash end cap here, and we can kind of just test how all of this is going to interact with each other. And then flipping back to the center console, sorry this is really bitsy and I'm realizing this now as I'm talking. Flipping back to the center console, I now have both sides of the center console fully mocked up into the car. All of the brackets which mount the center console itself to the tunnel made and installed, and just really happy with how that's come together. I'm not gonna lie, I had a little bit of worry when it came to bonding so many sectional 3D prints together over such a length. I think it's got a total length of 1.7 meters, and that all to line up and all finish in the right place, but it has, and I'm really happy with that. So now it's just a case of me going back in there, doing one more scan of that so I can bring that back into the design file for the center console, make sure everything is in the same place as what it is on the CAD, and go ahead and make that top slope panel and all the bracketry that's needed to mount that top slope panel, which is probably going to be the next thing that I'm going to do, so you'll probably find out about a little bit about that next week. And then the last thing that I'm going to mention, sticking on with Churchill, is the rear number plate design. So something else I did this week is I guess you could say it's an illuminated rear number plate, and it's not illuminated in the fact that the letters illuminate, but it's illuminated in the fact that it's built off of one panel which forms the black in the background as per every old number plate, and then it's got a clear layer for the letters and then a silver layer for the letters with LEDs sat behind that. And that what that allows you to do is basically have the light reflecting or emitting from the side of the letters instead of out from the front of the letters, which I think on that car is going to look super cool. It's kind of got the feel of like a speakeasy, like a gentleman's club. So having some kind of like, I want to say ambient, but practical lighting around that number plate is going to be really, really cool. So I'll throw some renders of that your way. Just about to start printing the actual backing for that. And good old Bruce is going to be laser cutting all like the letters and the number plate back in himself, and then we can kind of assemble it back here. So I'm going to leave it there and say thank you very much, viewers.
Right, thank you very much, Luke, and we're going to call it a day for this video. Do remember to like and subscribe, and if you want to go over into the Retropower shop and get one of those key rings, you're very welcome to. We would love that. And there are also garage banners, t-shirts, hoodies, and those awesome bobble hats available, although hopefully the weather might be improving soon and we won't need bobble hats for a few months. But now I've said that, obviously it's going to be bad. See you next week.